Today is a sad day in our nation's history. 160 years ago today, on April 14th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States of America, was assassinated by a 26-year-old stage actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth while attending the play Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Lincoln's assassination near the end of the American Civil War was part of a larger political plot by Booth to kill the three most powerful federal officials to resurrect the Confederate cause. Conspirators Lewis Powell and David Herold were assigned to kill Secretary of State William H. Seward, and George Atzerodt was tasked with killing Vice President Andrew Johnson. The plot failed beyond Lincoln's death. Seward was only injured, and Johnson's potential assailant got intoxicated rather than murdering the vice president. Following a spectacular first escape, Booth was killed after a 12-day pursuit. Powell, Herold, Atzerodt, and Mary Surratt were later hanged for their roles in the conspiracy. But let me tell you what happened that night. John Wilkes Booth, born in Maryland into a family of prominent stage actors, had by the time of the assassination become a famous actor and national celebrity in his own right. He was also a vocal supporter of the Confederacy and was initiated into the pro-Confederate Knights of the Golden Circle in Baltimore, Maryland towards the end of 1860. In order to coerce the Union into starting prisoner exchanges again, Booth came up with the idea to kidnap Lincoln. He recruited Samuel Arnold, George Atzerodt, David Herold, Michael O'Laughlin, Lewis Powell, also known as Lewis Payne, and John Surratt to help him. Surratt's mother, Mary, left her tavern in Surrattsville, Maryland, and moved to a house in Washington, D.C., where Booth became a frequent visitor. Booth and Lincoln were not personally acquainted, but Lincoln had seen Booth at Ford's Theater in 1863. Actor Frank Mordaunt wrote after the assassination that Lincoln, who had no suspicions about Booth, had admired the actor and had made several unsuccessful attempts to invite him to the White House. Booth attended Lincoln's second inauguration on March 4, 1865, writing in his diary afterward, "What an excellent chance I had, if I wished, to kill the president on Inauguration Day." As Lincoln was returning from a play at Campbell General Hospital in Northwest Washington on March 17th, Booth and the other conspirators made plans to kidnap Lincoln. However, attended a ceremony at the National Hotel instead of the play. Booth might have been able to attack Lincoln at the National Hotel if he had not been admitted to the hospital for the failed kidnapping attempt. Meanwhile, the Confederacy was collapsing. On April 3rd, Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital, fell to the Union Army, and on April 9th, General Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant and his Army of the Potomac after the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse. Confederate President Jefferson Davis and other Confederate officials had fled. Still, Booth remained committed to the Confederate cause and looked for a way to save it. He eventually decided to assassinate Lincoln. On April 14th, Booth's morning started at midnight. He wrote his mother that all was well, but that he was in haste. In his diary, he wrote that our cause being almost lost, something decisive and great must be done. Booth discovered that Lincoln and Grant were scheduled to attend a performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater that evening, while he was there at noon to retrieve his mail. He had performed there multiple times, so he was familiar with the theater's layout and its personnel, which gave him a particular good opportunity to attack Lincoln. Booth asked Mary Surratt to deliver a package to her tavern in Surrattsville while he was staying at her boarding house in Washington, D.C. Additionally, he requested that she instruct her tenant, Louis J. Weichmann, to prepare the firearms and ammunition that Booth had initially kept at the tavern. The conspirators met for the final time at 8:45 p.m. Booth assigned Powell to kill Secretary of State William H. Seward at his home, Atzerodt to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson at the Kirkwood Hotel, and Harold to guide Powell, who was unfamiliar with Washington, to the Seward house and then to rendezvous with Booth in Maryland. Booth was the only well-known member of the conspiracy. There were restrictions on access to the upper floor of the theater, which housed the presidential box, and Booth was the only conspirator who could have reasonably been expected to gain easy entry. Furthermore, the plotters' assumption that the box's entrance would be guarded would have been reasonable, but ultimately incorrect. If it had been Booth, would have been the only conspirator with a realistic chance of getting to the president, or at least opening the box without being searched for weapons. Booth intended to stab Grant at the theater after shooting Lincoln at close range with his single-shot Philadelphia Derringer pistol. Shortly after 10 o'clock, they were all supposed to strike at once. Atzerodt tried to withdraw from the plot, which to this point had involved only kidnapping, not murder, but Booth pressured him to continue. Booth had assigned Lewis Powell to kill Secretary of State William H. Seward. Seward was at his Lafayette Square home the night of the assassination, bedridden after and recuperating from wounds he had received when he was flung from his carriage on April 5th. Harold guided Powell to Seward's house. Powell carried an 1858 Whitney revolver, a large, heavy, and popular gun during the Civil War, and a Bowie knife. William Bell, Seward's maitre d', answered the door when Powell knocked at 10:10 p.m. As Booth made his way to the presidential box at Ford's Theater, Powell informed Bell that Seward's doctor had given him the medication and that he was to personally demonstrate to Seward how to make it. Overcoming Bell's skepticism, Powell made his way up to the stairs to Seward's third-floor bedroom. He repeated the medicine story to Assistant Secretary of State Frederick W. Seward, Seward's son, who stopped him at the top of the staircase. Frederick, suspicious, claimed his father was asleep. Hearing voices, Seward's daughter Fanny emerged from Seward's room and said, "Fred, father's awake now," thus revealing to Powell where Seward was. Powell turned as if to start downstairs, but suddenly turned again and drew his revolver. He aimed at Frederick's forehead and pulled the trigger, but the gun misfired, so he bludgeoned Frederick unconscious with it. Bell yelling, "Murder! Murder!" ran outside for help. Fanny opened the door again, and Powell shoved past her to Seward's bed. He stabbed at Seward's face and neck, slicing open his cheek. But the splint, which is sometimes misidentified as a neck brace that was fitted to Seward's fractured jaw, stopped the blade from entering his jugular vein. Seward's face was severely scarred, but he eventually recovered. Seward's son, Augustus, and Sergeant George F. Robinson, a soldier assigned to Seward, were alerted by Fanny's screams and received stab wounds and struggling with Powell. Powell ran downstairs toward the door while Augustus grabbed a pistol, where he ran into State Department Messenger Emmerich Hansel. Powell stabbed Hansel in the back and ran outside exclaiming, "I'm mad, I'm mad." Screams from the house had frightened Harold, who ran off, leaving Powell to find his way in an unfamiliar city. Booth had assigned George Atzerodt to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, who was staying at the Kirkwood House in Washington. At 10:15 p.m., Atzerodt was supposed to go to Johnson's room and shoot him. Atzerodt rented the room directly above Johnson's on April 14th. The following day, he showed up at the scheduled time and proceeded to the downstairs bar with a knife and gun. Asking the bartender about Johnson's behavior and character, at some point he threw his knife away and went out into the streets after getting drunk. He made his way to the Pennsylvania House Hotel by 2 a.m., where he obtained a room and went to sleep. Booth had visited the Kirkwood House earlier that day and left Johnson a note that read, "Do not wish to disturb you. Are you at home? J. Wilkes Booth." One theory is that Booth wanted to know if Johnson was expected at the Kirkwood that evening. Another is that Booth wrote the note to implicate Johnson in the conspiracy because he was worried that Atzerodt would not kill him. Well, anyways, back to Booth. Despite what Booth had heard earlier in the day, Grant and his wife Julia had declined to accompany the Lincolns, as Mary Lincoln and Julia Grant were not on good terms. The Lincolns' invitation was ultimately accepted by Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris, daughter of U.S. Senator Ira Harris of New York, after a series of other people declined. When Mary got a headache, she wanted to stay home, but Lincoln told her he had to go. He had to go because the newspaper said that he would. One of Lincoln's bodyguards, William H. Crook, told him not to go, but Lincoln insisted he had made a vow to his wife. Lincoln told Speaker of the House Schuyler Colfax, "I suppose it's time to go through, I would rather say," before assisting Mary into the carriage. After arriving late, the presidential party took up residence in their box, which was constructed by removing a dividing partition between two adjacent boxes. The play was interrupted and the orchestra played "Hail to the Chief" as the full house of about 1,700 rose in applause. Lincoln was seated in one of the rocking chairs that the Ford family had chosen for him. The cast modified a line of the play in honor of Lincoln when the heroine asked for a seat protected from the draft. The reply, scripted as, "Well, you're not the only one that wants to escape the draft," was delivered, instead as, "The draft has already been stopped by order of the president." A member of the audience observed that Mary Lincoln often called her husband's attention to aspects of the action on stage and seemed to take great pleasure in witnessing enjoyment. At one point, Mary whispered to Lincoln, who was holding her head, "What will Miss Harris think of my hanging on to you so?" And Lincoln replied, "She won't think anything about it." These were regarded as Lincoln's final words in the years that followed, but N.W. Minor, a family friend, claimed in 1882 that Mary Lincoln told him that Lincoln's last words expressed a wish to visit Jerusalem. Lincoln's usual protections were not in place that night at Ford's. Lincoln's bodyguard, Ward Hill Lemon, was away in Richmond on assignment from Lincoln, and Crook was working a second shift at the White House. John Frederick Parker was assigned to guard the presidential box. He went to a local tavern during intermission with coachman Francis Burke and Lincoln's valet, Charles Forbes. While he waited for his scheduled time, Booth had a few drinks. Parker was undoubtedly not at his post when Booth entered the box, though it is unclear if he went back to the theater. In any case, there is no guarantee that a famous person like Booth would not have been allowed entry. Booth had entered the box expecting a guard and had prepared a brace to bar the door. At around 10:10 p.m., Booth made his final entrance into Ford's Theater, this time through the front door. After spending some time at the tavern, he showed his calling card to Charles Forbes, then walked through the dress circle and to the door leading to the presidential box. Once inside the hallway, Booth barricaded the door by wedging a stick between it and the wall. From here, a second floor led to Lincoln's box. Evidence shows that earlier in the day, Booth had bored a peephole in the second door. Booth knew the play Our American Cousin and waited to time his shot at about 10:15 p.m. with the laughter at one of the lines of the play delivered by actor Harry Hawk. "Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal, you sock-doll-gizing old man trap." Lincoln was laughing at this time when Booth opened the door stepped forward and shot him from behind with his pistol. The bullet entered Lincoln's skull behind his left ear and traveled through his brain, and also fractured both orbital plates before landing close to the front of the skull. Lincoln slumped over in his chair and then fell backward. Rathbone turned to see Booth standing in gun smoke less than 4 feet behind Lincoln. Booth shouted a word that Rathbone thought sounded like freedom. Rathbone jumped from his seat and struggled with Booth, who dropped the pistol and drew a dagger with which he stabbed Rathbone in the left forearm. Rathbone again grabbed at Booth as he prepared to jump from the box to the stage. A 12-foot drop, Booth's riding spur became entangled on the Treasury flag decorating the box, and he landed awkwardly on his left foot. Many in the audience believed he was a member of the play as he started to cross the stage. Booth held his bloody knife over his head and yelled something to the audience. While it is traditionally held that Booth shouted the Virginia state motto, "Sic semper tyrannis," which is thus always to tyrants, either from the box or the stage, witness accounts conflict. Most recalled hearing "Sic semper tyrannis," but others, including Booth himself, said he yelled only "Sic semper." Some did not recall Booth saying anything in Latin. There is similar uncertainty about what Booth shouted next. In English, either "the South is avenged," "revenge for the South," or "the South shall be free." 2 witnesses remembered Booth's words as "I have done it." Major Joseph B. Stewart climbed over the footlights and orchestra pit and chased Booth across the stage as soon as he touched down. Rathbone's cries of "Stop that man" and Mary Lincoln's and Clara Harris's screams prompted others to join the chase as chaos ensued. Booth exited the theater through a side door, and on the way stabbed orchestra leader William Withers Jr. Booth pushed Joseph Burroughs, who was holding the horse, away as he jumped into the saddle of his escape horse and hit Burroughs with the knife handle. Young Union Army surgeon Charles Leal forced his way through the crowd to the presidential box door, but he was unable to open it until Rathbone, who was inside, saw and took out the wooden brace Booth had used to jam the door shut. As Mary held Lincoln and wept, Leal discovered him sitting with his head cocked to his right. His eyes were closed, and he was in a profoundly comatose condition, while his breathing was intermittent and exceedingly stertorous. Thinking Lincoln had been stabbed, Leal shifted him to the floor. Charles Sabin Taft, another doctor, was hoisted from the stage and placed in the box. Leal discovered the gunshot wound behind Lincoln's left ear after he and bystander William Kent cut away Lincoln's collar while unbuttoning his coat and shirt, while discovered no stab wound. Lincoln's breathing improved after he dislodged a blood clot, but he discovered that the bullet was too deep to be removed. He discovered that Lincoln's breathing was maintained by routinely removing new clots. Actress Laura Keene held the president's head in her lap after Leal had placed Lincoln on an artificial respiration. He pronounced the wound mortal. Leal, Taft, and another doctor, Albert King, decided that Lincoln must be moved to the nearest house on 10th Street because a carriage ride to the White House was too dangerous. 7 men carefully lifted Lincoln and carried him out of the theater, which was crowded with irate patrons. They decided to take Lincoln to one of the houses across the street after taking into account Peter Toltefel's Star Saloon next door. As soldiers carried Lincoln into the street in the pouring rain, a man urged them to go to William Peterson's tailor's house. The extraordinarily tall Lincoln was lying diagonally on a small bed in Peterson's bedroom on the first floor. The doctors removed Lincoln's clothing after removing everyone from the room, including Mrs. Lincoln, but they found no additional injuries. Lincoln was found to be cold, so they covered him with blankets and applied mustard plasters and hot water bottles. Later, more physicians arrived: Surgeon General Joseph K. Barnes, Charles Henry Crane, Anderson Ruffin Abbott, and Robert K. Stone, Lincoln's physician. All agreed Lincoln would not survive. Barnes probed the wound, locating the bullet and some bone fragments. Leal gripped the unconscious president's hand tightly to let him know that he was in touch with humanity and had a friend. As the bleeding persisted through the night and blood clots were removed to relieve pressure on the brain. At approximately 11 p.m., Lincoln's older son, Robert Todd Lincoln, arrived, but 12-year-old Tad Lincoln was kept away because he was at Grover's Theater watching an Aladdin play when he heard of his father's murder. Arriving were Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton and Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles. For the remainder of the night, Stanton effectively controlled the U.S. government from the House, including leading the search for Booth and the other conspirators. After insisting that the sobbing Mrs. Lincoln leave the sick room, many officials and doctors were admitted to pay their respects, and guards kept the public at bay. Initially, Lincoln's features were calm and his breathing was slow and steady. Later, one of his eyes became swollen and the right side of his face was discolored. Monsell Bradhurst Field wrote in a letter to the New York Times that Lincoln then started breathing regularly, but with effort, and did not seem to be struggling or suffering. As he neared death, Lincoln's appearance became perfectly natural, except for the discoloration around his eyes. Shortly before 7 a.m., Mary was allowed to return to Lincoln's side, and as Dixon reported, she again seated herself by the president, kissing him and calling him every endearing name. Lincoln died at 7:22 a.m. on April 15th. Mary Lincoln was not present. In his last moments, Lincoln's face became calm and his breathing quieter. Field wrote there was no apparent suffering, no convulsive action, no rattling of the throat, only a mere cessation of breathing. According to Lincoln's secretary, John Hay, at the moment of Lincoln's death, a look of unspeakable peace came upon his worn features. The assembly knelt for a prayer, after which Stanton said either now he belongs to the ages or now he belongs to the angels. On Lincoln's death, Vice President Andrew Johnson became the 17th President of the United States. The presidential oath of office was administered to Johnson by Chief Justice Salmon Chase sometime between 10 and 11 a.m. Also today, on April 14th, 1912, is the day the RMS Titanic struck an iceberg at 11 at night. The iceberg hit the Titanic on its right side while trying to put a hard to starboard. But the iceberg hit, and which created a couple of holes in one of the forward lower compartments to flood. So the crew were ordered to close the watertight doors, and which prevents the water from coming in from other floors. Then a couple hours later, it sank, taking 1,500 people with it. Well, that's all I have for you on the Lincoln assassination and the iceberg. So if you like what you hear, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. This is Stephen Luke, and I'll see you again for another history update.